The polished marble floors of the Gilded Orchid reflected the cold, crystalline light of the chandeliers, turning the restaurant into a jewel box of hushed conversations and the delicate clinking of silver on porcelain. Avery moved through it all with a practiced economy of motion, her light blue shirt and black vest a stark, simple uniform against the opulent backdrop. She was a ghost here, efficient and invisible, her purpose singular: earn enough to cover the next round of Chloe's medication and disappear back into the city's anonymity. Tonight, however, invisibility was not an option. He was here. Jin Woo Kwon sat at table 12, his usual corner booth that offered a panoramic view of the entire dining room, a king on his throne. His presence altered the restaurant's atmosphere, drawing the ambient tension into a tight, focused knot around his table. Avery felt it like a change in air pressure. Her manager, Mr. Henderson, had approached her with slick sweat on his brow, his hands fluttering nervously. "Avery, table 12. Just be quick. Be polite. Don't make eye contact unless you have to," she had simply nodded, her expression unreadable. Now, as she approached the table, she could feel the gazes of his two guards, men built like mountains in tailored suits. But her focus was on the man they flanked. She kept her own gaze meticulously lowered, her attention fixed on the polished surface of the table. She placed water glasses down with steady hands. She set out the menus. Her voice, when she spoke, was level and professional, directed not at the silent figure in the center, but at the man to his right, his lieutenant, Min Jun. "May I take your drink order, sir?" Her refusal to acknowledge the man in charge was a quiet, deliberate rebellion. It was all she had. In a world of predators and power, this small negation was her territory, her line in the sand. She would not offer him the deference he commanded from the rest of the world. She would serve his table, but she would not serve him. She took the order, her pen scratching softly on her notepad, and turned to leave. The silence that followed her was more profound than any shout. She felt his eyes on her back, a physical weight, cold and heavy. It was a silent challenge, a question she had no intention of answering. The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. Every server, every busboy, even the chefs peering through the kitchen window knew who sat at table 12. They also saw Avery's calculated disregard, a performance of professional indifference so perfect it became an act of supreme defiance. Mr. Henderson wrung his hands near the service station, his face pale. He kept shooting her frantic, pleading looks, but Avery's focus was a fortress. She delivered their drinks, placing Jinwoo's glass of mineral water on the table without a flicker of recognition, her eyes on the coaster, the wood grain, anywhere but his face. He hadn't moved. His hands rested on the table, still and composed. He didn't eat the bread she brought, didn't touch his drink. He simply watched her. His stillness was unnerving, a predator conserving its energy, its gaze locked on its prey. Avery could feel the heat of that stare every time she passed the table, a brand against her skin. She cleared plates from a neighboring table, her back to him, the muscles between her shoulder blades tight with tension. She could hear the low murmur of his men, but his voice remained absent. The silence from him was a weapon, winding the tension in the room tighter and tighter until it felt thin enough to snap. Then it happened. The quiet command, spoken in a low, resonant voice that cut through the clatter of the restaurant like a shard of glass. It wasn't directed at her. He spoke to Min Jun, his gaze still fixed on Avery's back. "Bring her to me." The words were not a request. They were an edict. The world around Avery went silent. The couple at table 10 stopped talking. A busboy froze, a stack of plates trembling in his hands. Mr. Henderson scurried forward, his face a mask of terror, intercepting her before she could take another step. "Avery, please," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Don't make this difficult. Just go." "Apologize." Avery's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. But her expression remained calm, a careful sculpture of neutrality. She handed her tray to the frozen busboy, straightened her vest, and turned. She met Mr. Henderson's terrified eyes with a slow, deliberate nod. Then, she began the long walk across the marble floor, each step echoing in the cavernous silence, moving toward the man who had summoned her. The air grew thick and heavy as she approached, like moving through water. Jinwoo's guards, Minjun included, rose as one and stepped away from the table, melting back into the shadows of the restaurant. The gesture was clear. He wanted her alone. Avery stopped at the edge of the table, her hands clasped loosely behind her back, a posture of service that felt like a mockery of the situation. She waited. He didn't speak immediately, letting the silence stretch, using it to measure her, to dissect her composure. Finally, he lifted his head, and for the first time, she allowed herself to meet his gaze. His eyes were dark, almost black, and held a piercing, analytical intelligence. They weren't angry, not in the way she expected. They were curious. "What is your name?" he asked. His voice was smooth, devoid of any discernible accent, a product of immense wealth and international education. "Avery," she replied, her own voice steady. "Avery. You have a problem with your job." "No, sir, then you have a problem with me. It wasn't a question." She took a breath. "I was assigned to serve your table, sir. My job is to ensure the table receives its order. It does not require personal acknowledgement of each guest." The distinction was subtle, academic, and utterly audacious. A flicker of something, surprise, respect, passed through his dark eyes. He leaned back in the booth, studying her. "Most people in this city trip over themselves to gain my attention. You actively avoid it. Why?" He was testing her, looking for the fear he was so accustomed to seeing. She would not give it to him. "Your attention seems like a dangerous thing to have, sir. I prefer to be safe." A corner of his mouth tilted up, a ghost of a smile. "And yet, here you are, at the most dangerous table in the city." He gestured to the empty chair opposite him. "Sit." She remained standing. "I'm on duty. You are now off duty," he stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. Reluctantly, she slid into the plush leather chair. The power dynamic shifted, becoming something more intimate, more perilous. He pushed a small, velvet box across the table. "A gift." "For your trouble." She didn't touch it. "I can't accept that." "Why not?" "Because I haven't done anything to earn it. And I don't accept payment for things I haven't earned." His gaze intensified, stripping away her uniform, her composure, trying to see the woman beneath. "What is it you want, Avery?" She finally let a sliver of her exhaustion show. "I want to finish my shift, collect my tips, and go home." He fell silent for a long moment, his eyes searching hers. He seemed to find something there that satisfied him. He nodded slowly. "Go, just like that." She was dismissed. But as she stood to leave, he spoke again, his voice low and carrying a weight of finality. "This isn't over." The weight of his final words clung to Avery like a shroud as she mechanically finished her shift. Her hands trembled slightly as she cashed out, the crisp bills feeling flimsy and insignificant. All she wanted was the sanctuary of her small apartment, the comforting rhythm of Chloe's soft breathing from the other room. Mr. Henderson avoided her eyes, pressing her tips into her hand with a clammy, fearful grip. She didn't blame him. She had invited the wolf to the door. The back alley was her usual shortcut, a narrow passage smelling of grease and rain-soaked concrete. The single flickering bulb overhead cast long, dancing shadows. It was in one of these shadows that the world tilted on its axis. The first sign of trouble was not a sound, but a sudden, violent displacement of air as a black sedan screeched to a halt at the alley's mouth, blocking her exit. Doors flew open. Men in dark coats spilled out, their movements sharp and predatory. They were not Jinwoo's men. Their faces were hard, Slavic, their intent radiating like a killing frost. Simultaneously, the back door of the restaurant burst open. Jinwoo emerged, flanked by Minjun. They were heading for his car, parked further down. They froze, seeing the blockade. It was an ambush, a trap. Avery was caught directly in the middle, a pawn on a chessboard she never even knew she was playing on. Panic seized her, cold and absolute. Her feet felt rooted to the cracked pavement. One of the new men, large and brutal with a scar bisecting his eyebrow, spotted her. A cruel grin split his face. He lunged, his hand clamping around her upper arm like a vice. "Look what we have here," he snarled in a thick Russian accent, yanking her in front of him. A shield. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of terror. The rough fabric of his coat scratched her cheek, the smell of stale cigarettes and violence filling her lungs. Across the alley, Jin-woo's face, which had been a mask of cold composure, shattered. For a split second, Avery saw something raw and unguarded there, a flash of pure, unadulterated fury. It wasn't the calculated anger of a crime boss whose exit was blocked. It was something primal, something personal. He took a step forward, into the line of fire, his focus entirely on her, on the hand that held her captive. The unspoken challenge from the restaurant had just erupted into open warfare, and she was the prize. The alley exploded into a cacophony of violence. A gunshot cracked the night air, deafeningly loud between the brick walls. The man holding Avery grunted as a bullet tore through his shoulder, his grip on her faltering for a crucial second. In that instant, Jin-woo moved. He wasn't a man anymore. He was a blur of lethal grace, closing the distance with impossible speed. The scene fractured in Avery's perception. The muzzle flash, the glint of a knife under the flickering bulb, the pained snarl of her captor. Jin-woo slammed into the man, not with a punch, but with a precise, brutal strike to the throat using the edge of his hand. The Russian gasped, his eyes wide with shock as he released her, stumbling backward. Jin-woo didn't spare him a second glance. He grabbed Avery's arm, his grip firm but not painful, and shoved her behind him. "Stay behind me," he commanded, the words a low growl. He became a living wall between her and the chaos. What followed was a ballet of bloodshed. Min-jun engaged two other men, his movements economical and deadly. But Jin-woo was the center of the storm. He disarmed one attacker, breaking his wrist with an audible snap, and used the man's own knife to neutralize another. He moved with a terrifying fluidity, each action flowing into the next, his tailored suit a dark whisper in the violent dance. Avery pressed herself against the cold brick wall, her breath hitched in her throat, unable to look away. This was the reality beneath the polished veneer she had witnessed in the restaurant. This was the predator stripped of its disguise. A shot rang out, closer this time, and Jin-woo grunted, a line of fire searing across his left bicep. He barely flinched, spinning to drive his elbow into his assailant's jaw. The fight was over in less than a minute. The alley fell silent, the only sounds the dripping of a leaky pipe and the ragged, harsh breaths of the three survivors. Two of Dimitri's men were dead. The others had fled. Jin-woo stood in the center of the carnage, his chest rising and falling heavily. He turned to face her, and the intensity in his eyes was staggering. His suit was torn at the shoulder, a dark, wet patch of crimson already spreading through the expensive fabric. He looked at her, his gaze sweeping over her from head to toe, checking for injuries. The fury was gone, replaced by a grim, possessive concern. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice strained. She could only shake her head, the words trapped in her throat. He had saved her. The man she had defied had just become her protector. He didn't give her a choice. "You're coming with me." It was a statement of fact, not a suggestion. Min-jun was already dragging bodies out of sight, his efficiency chilling. The adrenaline that had flooded Avery's system began to recede, leaving a profound, bone-deep tremor in its wake. Arguing was futile. She was a witness, a liability, and now, inexplicably, a person of interest to him. He led her to his car, a sleek black sedan that seemed to absorb the dim light of the alley. The ride to his penthouse was silent and suffocating. The city lights blurred past the tinted windows, a world away from the bubble of tension inside the car. His penthouse was a monument to sterile perfection, all glass, chrome, and shades of gray. It overlooked the city like a hawk's nest, beautiful and utterly lifeless. There were no photographs, no books, no sign that a human being actually lived there. As soon as the door closed, the formal facade he maintained began to crumble. He leaned against the wall, his face pale under the recessed lighting, his hand instinctively going to his bleeding arm. The dark stain on his white shirt had grown significantly. He had ignored the wound, focusing only on her. The sight of his blood, stark and real, broke through her fear-induced paralysis. "You're bleeding," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's nothing," he dismissed, starting to walk towards a bar in the corner. "It's not nothing. You need to clean it before it gets infected." The waitress in her, the caretaker she had been for Chloe for years, took over. She found a first aid kit in a pristine bathroom cabinet, her hands still shaking as she pulled out antiseptic wipes and bandages. He was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows when she returned, staring out at the sprawling city lights. He watched her approach in the reflection. "I don't need your help," he said, his voice tight with pain and pride. "Too bad," she retorted, her own stubbornness surprising her. "You're getting it." "Sit down." To her astonishment, he obeyed. He sank onto a low leather sofa, shrugging out of his ruined jacket with a wince. As she knelt before him and began to clean the ugly gash on his arm, the vast, empty space of the penthouse shrank until it contained only the two of them. Her touch was hesitant at first, then grew more confident. He was unnervingly still, his muscles tense beneath her fingers. He watched her face, the focused line of her brow, the way she bit her lip in concentration. It was the closest he had ever been to this kind of simple, unselfish care. "Why?" he asked softly, the question hanging in the air between them. "Why did you help me?" She didn't look up from her work. "Because you were hurt. And because you helped me first." When she finished wrapping the bandage, her fingers lingered on his arm for a moment too long. A current passed between them, silent and potent. In that moment, he wasn't a monster. He was just a man, wounded and bleeding in his empty castle. The next morning, the fragile truce built over bandages and antiseptic had evaporated, replaced by a gilded cage. Jean Woo stood by the windows, dressed in a fresh, immaculate dark gray suit, the pristine white bandage on his arm the only sign of the previous night's violence. He informed her, in that same calm, unarguable tone, that she could not go home. Not to her job, not to her apartment. "Dmitry Volkov saw you," he stated, his back to her. "He saw you with me. Now, he thinks you are mine. He will use you to get to me." The possessive implication in his words sent a chill down her spine, mixed with a confusing flicker of heat. "I am not yours," Avery said, her voice sharp with defiance. "I have a life. I have a sister who depends on me. I can't just disappear." "Your sister's medical care will be handled," he replied, turning to face her. His expression was impassive, but his eyes held a deep, turbulent intensity. "She will be moved to a private facility where she will receive the best treatment, and she will be protected. You will both be safer this way." He was hijacking her life, taking over the one thing that was entirely hers, her responsibility for Chloe. Anger, hot and fierce, surged through her. "You can't do that. You can't just buy my life and put it in a box." "I am not buying it," he countered, taking a step closer. "I am protecting it. Do you have any idea what a man like Volkov would do to you? To your sister? He would destroy you simply to watch me react." The space between them crackled with tension. She was trapped, her world shrinking to the confines of his will. All her fight, all her carefully constructed walls, were useless against the sheer force of him. Tears of frustration pricked her eyes. "Why?" she demanded, her voice breaking. "Why are you doing all of this for me?" He was in front of her now, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. His gaze dropped to her lips, and the air grew thin, heavy. "Because," he confessed, his voice dropping to a rough whisper, "he saw me look at you in that restaurant. Before any of this happened. He knows you are not just some waitress to me." The admission hung between them, a raw and stunning revelation. It was the truth behind his obsession, the reason for his fury in the alley. Before she could process it, he reached out, his hand coming up to cup her jaw, his thumb stroking her cheek. The gesture was shockingly gentle. Her breath caught. The magnetic pull she had felt from the beginning became an irresistible force. He lowered his head, and his lips met hers. It was not a soft kiss. It was intense, a desperate collision, a release of all the fear, anger, and unspoken tension that had been building between them since the moment she first ignored him. It was a kiss that sealed her fate, branding her as his in a way Volkov had only suspected. The kiss shattered something inside Avery, breaking down the last of her resistance and replacing it with a terrifying, exhilarating confusion. When he pulled back, they were both breathing heavily, the echo of their connection still humming in the air. He had moved her and Chloe, just as he said he would. Chloe was in a state-of-the-art medical facility under an assumed name, oblivious to the storm her sister was caught in. Avery was in a secluded, luxurious house outside the city, guarded by Jean Woo's most trusted men. It was another beautiful prison. Days bled into one another. Jean Woo visited every evening. Their interactions were a strange dance of conflict and intimacy. They would argue, Avery fighting against her confinement, and he would counter with cold, hard logic about the danger she was in. But underneath the arguments, the current that had been ignited by their kiss flowed, strong and undeniable. One evening, Minjun delivered a small, innocuous-looking envelope to Jinwoo while Avery was in the room. Jinwoo opened it, his face hardening into a mask of cold fury as he read the single sheet of paper inside. He crumpled it in his fist. "What is it?" Avery asked, her heart beginning to pound. He didn't answer, his jaw tight. He walked to the window, staring out into the darkness. "Jinwoo, what is it?" she insisted, coming to stand beside him. He finally turned to her, his eyes black with a rage that frightened her. "It's from Volkov. He knows where Chloe is. He sent the name of her facility. It's a threat, a direct challenge." The floor seemed to drop out from under her. The one person she had spent her life protecting was now a target because of her. "This is my fault," she whispered, horrified. "No," he said, his voice a low growl. He reached out, taking her hand, his grip surprisingly steady. "This is my fault. I brought this into your life. And I will be the one to end it." He was going after Dmitri. A final confrontation. "You can't just go charging in," she said, her mind racing, latching onto anything that could give him an edge. "There has to be a plan." She thought back to her nights at the restaurant, to the fragments of conversation she had overheard from the city's underbelly. "Volkov," she said, her eyes widening. "He has a routine. I heard his men talking once. Every week, he goes to the old Red Hook cannery. Alone. To oversee his smuggling shipments." Jinwoo looked at her, a new light in his eyes. He had an army of informants, but this was something they had missed. A detail from a waitress who paid attention. He saw her then not as a liability to be protected, but as a partner, a queen in his deadly chess game. He pulled her closer, his forehead resting against hers. The rage in his eyes softened into a fierce, protective resolve. "I will end this tonight." Before he left, he kissed her again. This time, it was different. It was slower, deeper, filled with the terrifying possibility of a final goodbye. It was a promise. "Come back," she whispered against his lips, her hands clutching the front of his shirt. "Come back to me." He looked at her one last time, his gaze holding hers, and then he was gone, leaving her alone in the silence to pray. The hours that followed were the longest of Avery's life. She paced the length of the safe house, a caged animal, every distant siren setting her heart racing. Minjun had stayed behind, his presence a silent, stoic guard at the door. He had a secure line, and the occasional, terse update he received was all Avery had to cling to. They've engaged silence. There's been an exchange of fire, more silence. The narrative of the night was told in these brutal, fragmented dispatches. She imagined the scene at the Red Hook cannery, the smell of rust and salt, the echo of gunshots in the cavernous space, the glint of metal in the dark. She pictured Jinwoo, not as the calm, powerful man in the suit, but as the deadly fighter from the alley, a force of controlled violence moving through the shadows. Her information had been good. Volkov was there, with only a small security detail, caught completely by surprise. But Dmitri was a cornered rat, treacherous and unpredictable. The final update from the cannery came just before dawn. It's done. Volkov is dead. Relief washed over Avery so powerfully her knees went weak. But it was followed by a chilling addendum from Minjun's contact. Kwon is down. He's hurt. Badly, the world went gray at the edges. Minjun was already moving, issuing sharp commands into his phone, preparing for their return. When the black sedan finally pulled up to the house, Avery was waiting at the door, her fear a cold, hard knot in her stomach. Minjun and another guard helped Jinwoo out of the car. He was barely conscious, leaning heavily on them, his shirt soaked through with blood from a vicious knife wound in his side. He had killed Volkov, but not before the Russian had dealt a nearly fatal blow. In that moment, watching him stumble, pale and broken, the last vestiges of Avery's fear of him vanished, replaced by a fierce, overwhelming wave of protectiveness. The power dynamic that had defined their relationship had completely inverted. He was no longer the predator, the king, the unstoppable force. He was vulnerable. He was hers to save. She rushed forward, her hands steady, her voice clear and commanding. Bring him inside. Get him on the sofa. I need the medical kit. Now, her orders cut through the controlled panic of his men. They looked at her, this waitress who had been their boss's obsession, and for the first time, they saw a leader. They saw the woman he had been willing to risk everything for. She knelt beside him, her hands already working to cut away the blood-soaked fabric, her mind sharp and focused, determined to keep him tethered to this world. In the quiet days that followed, the safe house transformed from a prison into a sick room, a sanctuary. A discreet doctor, loyal to Jinwoo, had stitched the wound, but warned that the recovery would be slow. Infection was a constant threat. Avery refused to leave his side. She became his nurse, his caretaker, his anchor. She cleaned his wound, spoon-fed him broth when he was too weak to eat, and sat by his bedside through long, feverish nights, placing cool cloths on his forehead. His men, including the ever-present Minjun, watched with a quiet, growing respect. They saw how he settled when she was near, how his restless sleep eased when she held his hand. In his weakness, he was more human than she had ever seen him. The layers of power and danger were stripped away, leaving the man beneath. They talked during his lucid moments, their voices soft in the still house. She told him about Chloe, about her dreams of being a nurse, about the crushing weight of responsibility she had carried alone for so long. He, in turn, told her about his own life, a world of calculated violence and profound loneliness, a kingdom he had built, but in which he had no home. I owned everything, he whispered one afternoon, his eyes tracing her face as she changed his dressing. But I had nothing of value. Not until I saw you. He admitted that her defiance in the restaurant had been like a light turning on in a dark room. She hadn't feared him, she had dismissed him, and in doing so, she had become the only person who truly saw him, not his reputation. As his strength returned, so did the intensity in his gaze. The physical space between them, once charged with fear and tension, was now filled with a deep, tender intimacy. He would reach for her hand, his fingers lacing with hers, a simple gesture that felt more profound than any grand declaration. He made arrangements, his quiet commands over the phone reshaping her entire world. Chloe's medical bills were paid in full, a trust fund established for her future. Her old apartment was gone, her meager possessions moved to a new, beautiful home in a safe neighborhood that was now hers, no strings attached. He was giving her freedom, the very thing he had taken away. One evening, he was strong enough to sit up on his own, watching her as she organized his medication on the bedside table. Avery, he said, his voice clear and strong for the first time in days. She turned. The look in his eyes held a lifetime of unspoken emotion. He reached out, not for her hand, but to gently touch her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. You are my gravity, he said, the words a raw, simple truth. You hold me to the earth. He drew her in for a kiss. It was not the desperate collision of their first, nor the fearful promise of their second. It was a kiss of homecoming, soft and sure, a testament to the quiet, unshakable love that had grown in the crucible of violence and fear. He was still a dangerous man, and his world would always have shadows, but in Avery, he had found his light. And she, the waitress who had refused to bow, had found a love more powerful than she had ever imagined, in the heart of the one man she should have feared the most.